Hello, and thank you for joining us for CBM Calling. We're so glad that you've decided to spend a few minutes with us this afternoon. Today, we are talking about a very important topic, which is how this COVID-19 crisis has impacted Indigenous communities. And I am thrilled to be joined by my dear friend and my colleague, Cheryl Bear, CBM's Indigenous Relations Specialist. She's in Prince George in BC. And it is wonderful to see you, Cheryl. How are you doing?
Yes, it's good to see you too, Jennifer. It's I love these Zoom things because it just kind of brings us together no matter how far we are apart. I'm doing okay. I got a call or a message from the pastor at Kingsway in Toronto there, asking about Indigenous artists, and he asked, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm cautiously optimistic with the side of existential dread." And
That's good.
that's my answer. So
That's a great description of I think how most of us feel right now.
yeah, it's true. It's true.
Cheryl, we've asked you to come on today because we've been hearing in the news about how this crisis has been impacting particularly Indigenous communities. And this has become a huge concern for a lot of us when we're hearing the things that are happening and how it's been disproportionately affecting Indigenous communities. Can you tell us a bit more about what you've been hearing or what you've been reading?
For sure. Yeah, it's actually quite daunting. Looking at some of the things that are happening in the U.S. with the Navajo Nation. There's just and of course there we have similar situation here. We have a housing crisis amongst most First Nations communities, and we have a couple of families living in one home. So the social distancing and all that, and we're very connected. We are helping elders and help taking elders to town to check their mail and stuff. And there's lots of things that we do as a community. And so when it comes to physical distancing and thinking about COVID, it's tricky. It's really tricky, and of course, it's terrifying seeing what's going on in Navajo Nation. We've been praying for them and thinking about them, and I've been posting stuff about them. So yeah, that's a tough one. And here it's not quite as bad here, but we're afraid it's going to get here. And now, of course, there's an elder who passed away in Alert Bay, and so it's coming closer and closer, and that's always kind of daunting. So.
Well, I was just reading that an article today talking about how with the Navajo community, it's just some experts are thinking this is just the beginning. Like it's
Yeah.
not even reached its peak yet, which is really frightening. I mean, it's 25. I think they said 25% of the cases in New Mexico were from Navajo people, and I mean that's a terrifying statistic. And I think that's what we are so concerned about here in Canada as well. We don't want to hear those kind of statistics in any of our Indigenous communities here in Canada. I was reading recently about a community in northern Saskatchewan. I don't know if you've heard about this as well. I think it's the Clearwater Dean First Nations that it's been really particularly hard hit in this past week, and a couple of the elders have died as well. I'm just, yeah, it's sad when you think because as you've taught me how important elders are to any of the Indigenous communities, and it means so much when an elder passes away. It's such a significant loss to the entire community. I'm just wondering, a lot of us we're scared, I think, of what we're hearing about this because there were already so many concerns beforehand, even before this whole crisis started, about how vulnerable Indigenous communities were. The lack of access to health care, the lack of access to clean water. These are all things that already we had heard about. I'm just wondering if you're seeing like all of these things now are just being exacerbated, right? Because these are all the things that you require when you get sick, right? And now, we're seeing like the result of that.
Oh, hang on. My daddy just walked in. Hi, Daddy.
Oh,
My 83-year-old dad. Speaking of elders,
oh yay.
back from the store.
Oh, yay. Hi, Cheryl's dad. We can't see him on the screen yet, but we hope to.
I'm not sure, but anyway, he refuses to stay home. But anyway, so I'm like,
I feel your pain because my parents also will not stay home. So they don't want to, but we're forcing them to. But same problem. Um, so I'm just wondering if you are hearing more about how some of these communities are dealing with this. And now that,
Yeah, it's oh, you froze up there for a bit. Sorry,
go
I
ahead,
didn't hear.
Cheryl,
What's that?
go ahead. You froze up for a bit too, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, the vulnerability, of course, for Indigenous people has been an issue, especially the drinking water, the lack of clean drinking water. And I remember visiting Pikanchicum years ago,
Mm,
and there was we had to go into like sort of the center of town, and we had to use this well.
mm,
And I was like, oh my goodness, it's like Samaritan woman, we're sitting here at the well in the middle of the day, and that's where the community had to go and get their water. And it was it was a lot of work for sure, but it was also, it just felt so wrong. I thought, how can we be here in Canada and having these issues? How can we be in one of the most beautiful, prosperous countries that were known as peacekeepers all around the world, and yet here we have folks that are just, they're having to walk down, and that village had, I think, about 1,000 people in it or something like that, or anyways, it was a large village, but yeah, and it was staggering, and I don't quite know how to deal with all of that. And somebody's response when they had, I think when Attawapiskat declared a state of emergency a few years ago, one of the responses was, well, why don't they just move to Toronto? But that brings us back to land and the value of land, and how we feel like land is the most important thing to us because of the spiritual, emotional, physical connection. Just the Creator placed us on our land, gave us the land to watch over, to share, and the animals and the water as well is included in that. And so, so yeah, those values, we can't just move away. One of our if something happened and it destroyed a lot of the land in the surrounding areas, people would move away to a better place, but we wouldn't. We are so connected. Atlehuatan, and it's about an hour and a half west of here, Prince George, and we're part of the Daketh Nation. We used to be called carriers. The French fur traders called us carriers because they said we were exceptionally good at carrying heavy load distances. And I always say, I think they were prophetic. But Daketh means the people who travel on the water, and Natle means the place where the salmon return. And those things that the land, it's so important. So we have to be very creative, and I think now you see in the Navajo Nation, you see people coming in with water, and Colorado and different places are donating truckloads of water, and it's amazing to see that. And it's too bad that it took a worldwide pandemic emergency to get that, but and of course, I think for the world to hear on the news, oh, this is affecting the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo Nation people don't have running water. I'm sure people all over the world were like, wait, what? In the USA, the most, a little bit of a awful spotlight on that.
You highlighted the connection First Nations people have to their land. And often you'll hear, stories of like overcrowding on certain reserves. Have you seen that yourself? Because I know you visited reserves all over North America. I'm wondering if you have witnessed that. I don't know what it's like in Notley, but have you seen that? And it explains a lot as to why people say, well, why don't they just move away if it's so overcrowded?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's, again, the different value. There's grandparents are often very closely connected, very closely, often their families will live together. And back in the day, before, of course, there were any settlers here, we would have big houses. They were called a big house. And in your area, I remember I visited one time Six Nations, they have a really cool museum thing that you can walk around, and there's this great big house that they have, and of course there would be lots of families living in there, but there would be kind of one matriarch or patriarch, usually a matriarch, um, that's like a beautiful way to live. You all would kind of live together, and that's how we always have done things. You know, the family was you have the grandparents who were the matriarch, patriarch, and then you have everybody else who does a lot of the work. The women and the men, the adults are busy working, gathering, hunting, whatever the case was, and the kids were being raised by the grandparents, and that's sort of the way that things have always been for us. So we still kind of do that, but now we have these, houses that are not big houses anymore, and so yeah, it's tricky, and it's a beautiful value. I think it's a beautiful thing to have grandparents so closely connected. When I remember talking with a group of Canadian Americans, and they were European background folks, and we were talking about. It came up that there was some grandparents that were raising the grandchildren, and they had said, oh, one of them said, oh, there's something wrong there, and I was like, what? Like, what do you mean there's something wrong there? That's no, I said, according, like, people of color, indigenous people all over the world, this is a normal thing for folks, from a lot of different countries. So so yeah, this beauty, but in a time where we need to be a little bit more separate and isolated, it's all the more tricky. So mhm.
When you're actually asking people to change their values, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about physical space. The idea of
Mhm.
community and living together and living with generations, right, is a
Mhm.
value for so many cultures, including, right, our First Nations cultures, and also for lots of people around the world, as you pointed out. That is an actual cultural value that
Mhm.
people hold, to be able to live that way. So when we say social distancing, it's very much it feels like it's fairly easy for us, some of us, to do, because of
Mhm.
our culture, in which
Mhm.
distance is already a thing of value to begin with. Right?
Yeah.
Our
Yeah.
individualism and having our, ability to drive into my garage and never see my neighbors, that's already a value that's being
Yeah.
held here. But
Yeah.
that's not a value for everybody. And so,
Yeah.
when we ask people
Mhm.
to socially distance, it's not actually that easy to do, because you're asking them to change the way they've lived for
Mhm.
centuries, right? For their
Yeah.
tradition. I'm wondering also about food security. I mean, this is a really scary topic that we've been talking about. We actually talked about it on CBM Calling yesterday, around how many people are food insecure in our world
Yeah.
right now, and now
Mhm.
even it's worsening as every day goes on, because they're not able to work. So I'm wondering if, in particular, are you hearing stories about, particularly, I think we worry for children and for women,
Mhm.
because we know that Indigenous children already live in a very high poverty rate to begin with. So I'm wondering
Mhm.
if you're hearing any stories.
Yeah, there's some wonderful stories about, like, schools that have taken their, they get a certain amount of money from the province or whatever to have a food, like a lunch program or a breakfast program, and they've taken that the money from that program, and instead of, kids of course being there and having the lunch there, they'll bag the lunch and they'll give it out in the community. And so
Mm,
I've heard some wonderful things like that.
mm,
But not so far. I haven't seen any, like, serious desperation. And I think that there's been a lot of pulling together, and a lot of watching out for each other. That also happens in Indigenous communities. It's like a small town where, everybody
mm,
knows everybody, and in times like this, we all just really pull together. When times are good, we have our little spats, just like, uh, but yeah, when it comes down to it, when we need one another, we're
mm,
there, right? That's how it is.
mm,
So yeah, not quite. I'm hearing in the news like, it's coming, and it feels like there's going to be shortages of things, and it was really
upsetting to see, farmers having to like dump milk out. And I was like, oh my goodness, that, because my dad, his parents lived through 2 world wars in Germany, what became East Germany, and he grew up he was born in 1936 there. So he grew up in that kind of, you don't waste food. So hearing that, it was just daunting. And of course, my mom growing up, being born in Auckland, born in the res, and the family. Her mom passed away when she was 4. But there was same kind of an idea. They would go in the summertime and they would live and trap and do all of that. And so they used everything. They didn't waste anything. And so that whole idea of that generation has impacted me. And I feel like I'm more of a wasteful person, of course, than they are. But one of the things that I was wondering about, and this is my great ponder. Sometimes I have those things happen to me, but when I saw some of this stuff, like there's too much meat, there's over, and it felt like there was like almost like overproduction of stuff because we waste so much. And I wondered if that was what was going on, because when we're doing our normal thing, Canadians and Americans, we're very wasteful, and we don't even realize it. We don't even really think about it because we're just so used to it. And now, because of COVID and because of stay at home, and you could be in your house for, and I think back then they said whatever 6 weeks or whatever. We've run right over that. But so people thinking, okay, I need food in my house for 6 weeks. Like, I'm going to have to, and everybody changed the way that we look at food. Everybody changed. Of course, the hoarding toilet paper, it got weird. But we all started thinking like rationing, like, oh, this is what I have. This is what I have. Now I have to be a better steward of it. And so we're not over buying, hope some people are, but being careful with what we have. And I think that has shown us maybe that overproduction was a lot of waste. I've been to buffets in my life, and you just see the bus boy, bus girl going by with a cart full of plates that are completely almost half full, and so much waste. And it's almost like there's a whole other lesson that we're getting, lots of lessons we're being forced to just reckon with during these terrible times.
It takes just one small crisis maybe I shouldn't say small, it is pretty significant crisis, but at the very start of this, just the seed planted that we wouldn't be able to go to the grocery store for a few weeks. And the absolute panic, I think it was the closest to most people have felt here of what it's like to be food insecure. Because for most people, they have no idea what it's like to live that way. Not be able to have adequate access to food on any given day that they want it.
And another thought about that, like thinking about people all over the world who, they always have, this is a constant thing for some countries and some places, living far below the poverty, and starvation is a normal thing. And we rarely see it, so it doesn't really touch us. Unfortunately, I think, we hopefully think we're donating to something, or we're doing our hopefully a little bit. It seems like a drop in the ocean most days. But another thought about that is in a lot of impoverished countries, the sort of the bottom of the barrel folks often are the Indigenous people, and they're the ones that in a lot of different countries, they're the ones who, like, the more dark your skin is in those countries, the worse off you are. And the worst racism, they don't get jobs. They just, so in some ways, Indigenous people all over the world are going to be struggling even more so because of the food scarcity. And it's tough. It's tough to talk about and to think about. And
And that is a great time for us to mention, for people who want to find out more, you've highlighted something, and you and I visited Bolivia to visit Indigenous women a few years ago. That was one of the highlights of my life. Until our next trip, Cheryl, which will be even better, I think. I don't know where we're going, but but there are Indigenous people all over the world. And they have been, as a whole, impacted by this whole crisis to a much higher extent than a lot of other people have. And if people want to find out more about that, there's a link that we're going to be posting, a UN site, a UN page that is particularly talks about Indigenous people and how they've been affected globally by this crisis. So we're going to please go on and look at that for people that want to find out more about Indigenous people and how they've been impacted by this whole thing. I guess before we conclude, I want to give some shout outs to people who've been watching today. And I know a lot of people that you know, people in your network are probably connected to this as well. So let's see. Well, Dennis Sherman, of course, who doesn't know Dennis? Dennis is our dear colleague out of Calgary. Dennis says it's always good to be able to hear from Cheryl. And Joey C, I think, hello from Vancouver. I think I've pronounced Joey's name wrong, so probably you know Joey, but of course I've pronounced Joey's name wrong, so you don't know who I'm talking about. Nancy Webb from here.
Oh yeah, hold on a second. While you're going through that, I'll talk to my dad.
That's okay, because Barb Key says to say hi to your dad, Fred.
Oh, yay!
That he stays well. So hi, Fred.
Oh, hang on. There, now you can say it. I'm on live on Facebook, Daddy.
Hi, Fred.
You can say hi to everybody.
Hi there. Who's that? Who's that? Paulina?
That's my friend Jennifer in Toronto.
Oh.
He's like, who is this person?
She's my boss, so be nice.
So you had breakfast?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
I just bought some. I was running around all morning. Rogers, no more smoked bacon.
Oh no.
Well, the Bens, they're out, and Rogers is even closed.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So
Okay.
We have found out the state of food security in Prince George. There's no bacon available.
There's no bacon. Oh, it's good to laugh. Oh my goodness.
It is
it's
good
so
to
good.
laugh.
So,
my cute daddy.
Oh, as we conclude, so it was good to see him. He looks well, so that's always wonderful and good for the heart to see. Before we end, we just want to say, what are some other ways that we can be helping? I know, this is the thing. Whenever we have these conversations, I don't want people to leave feeling like there's no hope. What can we do? Mm-hmm. Right? There's always things that we can do. So I'm wondering, what are some ways you think we can, ways we can help and we can stay connected?
Yeah, I think even having this, CBM calling and asking about this it makes me feel really good. So thank you for, even considering this. I was so happy when I got your message and thought this would be awesome. So this kind of a thing, talking about it, advocacy anyway, if you could, if you hear in your community about a First Nations community close to you or whatever that's struggling, you could call your local MP, or you can call whoever you need to call, just in government close by, to say, hey, we feel like you guys could be doing more, you could be helping. And I was talking with one of our friends in CBM, Jody Sparger, and we were talking about vulnerable people. And of course, the language has changed when you talk about inner city folks in Canada. People used to say things like street people or whatever, and then they were like, no, you can't say that. That's awful. Like, let's call them friends. Or they went to clients, I think, for a while, and then it was like, well, that's kind of, emotional distancing maybe. So let's call them friends. But now, we say vulnerable is, I think, a good word. But I was talking to Jody, and I said, what do we call it? It's almost like venerable might be a better way to put it, because, Jesus says, that, when you gave me a drink, that was, or when you gave that person a drink, that was me. So in that sense, but it's not always Indigenous people that are the poor ones. In a lot of ways, we are rich with family and community values, and values of the land, values of of one of my cousins, Serena. She goes out every summer during the salmon run, and another cousin, Gilbert, and they'll pull in like about 1,000 salmon each, and they're just out there, and that's an amazing amount of fish. Wow. And then they'll give it away and stuff to elders and take care of people. But that kind of reliance on the land is still happening with us, and I think that that's something that Indigenous people, and of course, treating the land as a gift from the Creator, which it is, treating animals like they're a gift, also is important. I think there's lots of things that Native people, that Indigenous people can teach non-Indigenous people. So that's something to be aware of. Always the education, always, take a First Nations studies class. There's a lot of free ones in some universities. And but also, if for those of you, we're going to post a link to a website that you can go to, and you can find out whose traditional territory you're on. It's native-land.ca, and you just pop in your city or town, and it'll show you who's the surrounding First Nations are. And if you don't know that, it's one of the ways that we stay grounded. And I always tell people the land acknowledgement is important to me. Whenever I hear it, I feel like a person. I feel like a human being, because for so many years I always tell the story in grade 6. The teacher said, "Oh, okay, this term we're going to study Indians in Canada." And of course, I'm born in '68, so that's how people talked then. And I was like, "Hey, that's us," And I looked at the only other Native kid in class, and we were like, "Cool." And then the teacher it just took seconds for the teacher to ring through this, and he said, "We're going to be studying the Hurons in Eastern Canada." And we were like, "Who? Like where?" And we grade sixers, I have no clue. And then immediately he says, "The Hurons in Canada, or Eastern Canada, but we're pretty sure they're extinct." And then we were just like, "Oh my goodness!" Like, just shocking, right? And I've since met quite a few, and actually stayed at the Wadaki Hotel, which is one of the most gorgeous hotels in the world. And I was like, oh, that to hear that, it made me feel invisible. It made me feel like, just not a human being. So knowing whose land you're on and knowing the people right around us. And of course, that was the curriculum back then. The curriculum was meant to objectify people. And so if you don't know whose land you're on, if you don't know whose traditional territory you're living on, then it's much easier to just forget, to render us invisible. So I think some big steps would be to get to know whose land you're on, and of course learn, get those courses, read Indigenous authors, and I think that in that way, the more that we know, the more that we can tackle some tricky differences that we have, which differences are okay. The more we can walk in reconciliation. And it was my elders, it was Indigenous elders across Canada who came up with the idea for the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation, based on, of course, South Africa. But they were the ones that put the word reconciliation in that phrase. They could have left it out. They could have said, forget this, we're too hurt, we're too angry, but they put that in there. And then, so I feel like that's like a mandate, like that I have to live my life because of their mandate, their goal for reconciliation. So I feel like, again, that cautiously hopeful, cautiously optimistic that we can work that out. 7 generations maybe, but but stuff like this so helps. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. We will end our conversation there, but really it's just a beginning. And we want to encourage people to educate themselves, read more, find out whose land you're on. And if you want to connect with Cheryl, you can go to our website, cbmin.org. You can find Cheryl listed in our staff pages, and you can see a little email icon. You can click there and you can send Cheryl an email and connect with her. I know she welcomes conversations with anybody who wants to find out more about what it means to seek reconciliation with Indigenous people. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Cheryl. Always so good to talk to you and to connect with you and to hear your words of wisdom. And wonderful to see your father. Thank him for his surprise guest visit. We will have him on another show just by himself.
That's right. That's right. Oh, he would be interesting.
That would be a good conversation, I think. Tomorrow we can ask everyone to tune in because Adrian is going to be talking with Michael from Cuba. So we will give an update as to what is happening in Cuba. And thank you all for joining us today and have a good afternoon.